Hi, International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley here, and welcome to OnlineChessLessons.net, continued coverage of the 2012 World Chess Olympiad. Today we pick up in round 7, where the US is facing the host country, Turkey. On board 1, superstar GM Hikaru Nakamura, 2778, is facing GM Dragan Solak, 2599. Hikaru starts out with g3, pretty unpretentious, and after d5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop g2, c6, black sets up a solid pawn formation on the light squares, d3, bishop f5, castles, and we have a London system of the King's Indian attack. Basically, what black has done here is he's gotten his bishop outside the pawn chain, and the bishop is no longer a problem child sitting back on c8. Now, in order to make something for white and try and fight for some type of edge, Hikaru chases down the bishop. Here, I think black should consider bishop g4, and if white wants to chase the bishop, he's going to have to loosen his kingside a touch. Instead, he went back to g6 right away, and after knight takes, pawn takes, knight d2. Knight d7, e4, and black sees his center being chipped away at a touch. And after de4, de4, black does have a half-open h-file as compensation for the white bishops, and the pawn center is still fairly blocked. Here, according to Fritz, and I tend to agree, black should consider maybe queen c7. And for example, after knight c4, castle queenside. That way he's got counter chances down the d-file and the h-file. Instead, after d takes e4, black played e5, creating kind of a symmetrical pawn center, if you will, but the downside to this e5 is that it also weakens black quite a bit on the light squares and opens up some possibilities for white. So after e5, queen e2, white has what Roman Djindjinhashvili would call basically a free advantage of the two bishops. Bishop c5, at least this bishop has a nice diagonal. But now Hikaru plays interesting, very patiently, knight f3. Other typical ideas would be to play a3, contemplating a b4 advance, or rook to d1, simply being first on the d-file. But Hikaru goes his own way and plays knight f3, and after queen c7, again, a typical plan here would be bishop d2. This way, if black does try to castle, for example, then a little b4 action, bishop back, a little knight g5 to touch up the f7 point, and then a4, and we can see, after you study the position for a little bit, you realize black is kind of in the box here. Not easy for him to get counterplay. His king on c8 is going to come under attack. His pawn on f7 is a continued annoyance, and very easy for white to improve in this type of position. But instead of bishop d2, which would probably be pretty strong, Hikaru played h4. And here we see his ideas with bishop h3, get this bishop where it's not biting behind his pawn, but actually out on this nice h3 to c8 diagonal. Black continues rook f8, thinking to pull the knight back to f8. Rook e8, king g2, nudging forward, knight to f8, and now knight to g5. And here we see the downside to having these double pawns is that it doesn't have a useful pawn to push to h6 to kick this little guy away. And by putting the knight on g5, he nips his plan of knight e6 to d4 and nips it right in the bud. Instead of knight g5, queen c4, touching up this bishop was also reasonable. But knight g5, rook a day to d8, and now Hikaru takes away the b4 square, contemplates a b4 advance maybe, queen e7, and finally Hikaru develops his last piece and connects his rooks. Black plays knight to h7, and Hikaru more or less passes. Another plan would be to go ahead and play b4, and then retreat the knight. An interesting idea here is that when your opponent is in a cramped position, you really want to avoid the exchange of pieces. And this, of course, is a principle known since the time of Tarrasch. And the other point here is that the black knights are a bit redundant. The knight on h7 had one mission in life, which was basically to challenge the white knight on g5. Therefore, by retreating, your knight still has influence on e5 and d4, and this knight, well, it's still sitting on h7. So for example, after knight f8, rook a to d1, knight e6, and then c3, and white can claim a solid, definite positional plus here. But going back to the game, Hikaru simply played rook to e1, and after knight g5, bishop g5, and now black really needs to make the most of his prospects here. What he should do is play rook to d6, and then on c3, play rook over, and on rook over, then bishop back to b6. Well, white still would have his nice solid two-bishop advantage, but he hasn't really yet broken into the black position, and black has neutralized the d-file. So Fritz considers white's about half a pawn ahead. For example, in this type of ending, if the queens came off, the rooks came off, a shot like bishop to c8 could pluck a pawn on the queen side. So, I mean, white's not without chances to win the game, but it's still within the realm of defensibility. In the game, though, after bishop takes g5, black made a defensive error with queen c7. And now Hikaru strikes h5, taking advantage of the pin on the f6 knight. After g takes, he now gives double pawns on the f-file and plants his bishop in on f5. And we can see this bishop just dominates, absolutely dominates the light squares in the black position. And black has absolutely no one to contest him with. In fact, Fritz considers that white is actually a solid pawn up. Never mind that white's actually a pawn down for the moment. After king f8, now like what Hikaru did here, this is what we call delayed gratification. A lot of players would have played the silly queen takes h5. But Hikaru recoups the pawn with his rook. And after king e7, rook h5, he now has his rook on the open h-file. Rook h8, black logically tries to neutralize the h-file, and here Hikaru plays very nice, shows very deep understanding of the position. Instead of playing the automatic looking rook at a to h1, after which a pair of rooks would get exchanged, it would be extremely hard to break in, he plays g4. Very, very nice move. What's the point? Well, the point is now black has unpleasant choice. If he lets the rook sit, it's unpleasant, as we will see in the game, and if he exchanges, then after rook h5, gh5, he's simply given a passed pawn to the white team. So let's see what happens. After rook takes h5, rook h8, g4, very nice. And then on rook at d to g8, now king f3. Excellent, excellent, excellent play. Again, the exchange now with rook h5, gh5, and suddenly this passed pawn becomes a serious attacking unit. Someone's going to have to stay home and keep an eye on him. So after g4 and king f3, note how all the white pieces are able to utilize the light squares. It's almost like the light squares are Hikaru's personal highway in this game. So now black decides he'd better scurry off the h-file. After rook at h to h1, he goes over to f8. But now penetration on the light squares with rook h7. And again, notice it's all light square placement for the white forces. Here, black makes an error. He plays queen a5. I guess setting up the cheapo that if pawn to b4, queen takes a3 check. But of course, this position is not about cheap tactics. This is about one side playing a strategical masterpiece. But let's take a look. Suppose he'd played a little better with a move like rook d6. Well then, queen c4, attacks the bishop, queen b6, and then the very nice bishop to g6. And we can see the pincering in again on the light squares. For example, rook e6 looking to block, and now the very nice touch, rook d1. Bishop f2, queen to d3 threatens queen d7 mate, and on bishop d4, c3, black can try to play king back to take this bishop, but then you have bishop f5, rook d6, and simply winning a piece. Okay, so let's go back. So instead of queen a5 or rook d6, let's say black played b5, alertly trying to keep the queen off the light squares. Well then lightning could strike from the other side. Very nice move, king g2. And then on queen d6, the very nice stroke, g6. g5 threatening g6. For example, if rook g8, g6, rook over, and this is pretty ugly quick. Let's go back after the very nice g5. F takes g5. Power in with rook down. Queen d4. Just a quick note there that if queen down to d2, rook e6 check could be a very unpleasant news flash, because after king over, the queen is no longer protected. c3 would be a very nice deflection pawn sacrifice here, and on queen takes, queen h5, again pincering in and threatening g5, queen d2 protecting the pawn on g5, threatening the pawn on f2, but then rook e6 check, king d7, rook check, check, and rook d6 discovered check, splicing and dicing the black king and queen. So, after rook h7, penetration on the light squares. And this is one of the things that I often start with when I teach chess to my students starting out. How many squares are there on the board? They look at me and they say, of course, 64. How many are light squares? 32. How many are dark squares? 32. And the point of asking this question is to make them stop and think about light squares and dark squares. And this is a beautiful example of controlling the light squares, which means you already control half the board. And it's amazing that very, very strong players, this type of concept seems to elude them. So after rook h7, queen a5, Hikaru now plays queen c4. Note again, it's a light square piece placement, pincering in on e6 and f7. In the game, black sought to avoid being under attack by exchanging queens and walked right into queen e6 mate. Supported by the bishop, note the pawn on f7 is pinned by the rook, and note the two black rooks is what forms the Epaulette mate. Fantastic creative achievement by Hikaru Nakamura, but also a very good sporting achievement, leading the U.S. to a 3.5 victory over Turkey and propelling them back into medal contention in the 2012 World Chess Olympiad. Again, International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley, on behalf of OnlineChessLessons.net, thank you for joining us.